Yes. Nope. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kristie Jo King, president of NASW Pennsylvania. I'm really glad that you're all here with us tonight to have this very, very important discussion and conversation. You know, as social workers, I see lots of faculty on here, lots of individuals that I'm sure have been impacted by the testing itself through ASWB. You know, it just really glad to have you here and are looking forward to hearing, having you be active participants in this discussion tonight. We really want to hear your voice. We want to hear what your thoughts are on how we as a chapter should move forward. I'll pass it over to Claire.
Hello, everybody. My name is Claire Dente, and I am a professor in the undergraduate social work department at Westchester University. And I am also currently vice president for our Pennsylvania chapter of National Association of Social Workers. So I love social work and I'm happy to be here. Do you want me to say my words now, or is this just the introductions? Just checking with my colleagues here.
I think this is just the introductions, because
Okay.
I was just kind of thinking through my own processes of where I thought we should go next. So I'm going to jump back in. So thanks everyone for your introductions. We also have like a special guest that we'll introduce a little bit later on, but for now, I think we'll pause with the introductions. So I feel like everybody sort of knows what's going on and what the subject of what we're talking about today is. But just in case there's some of you who have kind of been on the proliferary, I'm like stumbling over that word, of the situation, that this is to discuss the recent data release by the ASWB. The ASWB, of course, is the Association of Social Work Boards. They're also the group that is responsible for the test that all of us have to take on a national level in order to get pretty much it's written into the laws of almost every state, commonwealth, municipality, et cetera, that, that you're, in order to get licensed or certified as a social worker, you're required to take and pass the national ASWB exam. So this impacts folks from all over the country. It's been quite some time when that NASW, the National Association of Deans and Directors, the Association of Black Social Workers, the Clinical Association, and others have been kind of pressing, in addition to like individual, deans, directors, et cetera, that have been pressing for the release of information relating to passage rates based on demographic populations. For quite some time, we were told that information was not collected or available. And then finally, just within the last month, 2 months, et cetera, it was finally like the board of ASWB did vote to release that data, and then they put forward this report that I don't have it immediately in front of me, but while someone else is talking, I'll track down the link and post that so that everybody has access to it as well. That does very clearly demonstrate some significant differences based on demographics, typically leaning towards the most vulnerable populations or folks who have been historically oppressed or marginalized. So with that, just sort of as the overall summary of like the situation and where it is, unless there's anything before we jump into that anyone else would like to add to that, then I'll pass it over to the next item on our agenda. Okay, without hearing from any of my co-presenters if they wanted to jump in, the next thing we wanted to share was Claire is going to offer the perspective from as a professor who has taught social work and is currently at the Westchester University.
Thanks, Johanna. So I guess the big, there's so much to this. It's so loaded. It's interesting to me that this basically came out because of the interstate compact that we have been, as Johanna said, so many researchers have been asking for data on ASWB for many years and not getting results. And what some of you may or may not know about the interstate compact process was this approach to try to help us to have more mobility with our licenses, particularly clinical licenses. And I believe it was because of military family members and spouses who were being moved around when their significant other was being moved, that we oftentimes found themselves moving and then having to start the licensure process all over again. So in those discussions, some of this came up about the exam, and finally we got our hands on some of the data, and the data was unfortunately what a lot of folks kind of were suspicious about, because of the fact that we figured if the data was really clean and said, hey, everyone's all good on this, they probably would have put it forward, right? But that did not happen. And so, you have this data that basically suggests that there's test disparities, and it's pretty consistent with a lot of standardized testing results. And as we think about this in terms of assessing competency, why do we even have measures in place and tests for these exams for licensure? And basically it has to do with assessing competency. But I'm not sure that assessing social work competency through a fill in the dot exam is always the best measure, right? We do know from the Council on Social Work Education that those of us entrusted with educating students through social work education are supposed to work towards their competence in social work knowledge, social work values, and social work skills. And I know, at our university, we are working in our program very hard to try to introduce more theorists so that are from diverse backgrounds, so that we don't just have the white male, Eric Erickson perspective on development, that we try to bring in some other folks as well to diversify how our students understand development and human behavior and all those different pieces. Our code of ethics is also a place where we see the social work values come through, things like self-determination and all of that. I would put forth that sometimes I feel some of our code of ethics might also be biased in terms of clinical work, in terms of micro work, and in terms, of this kind of very narrow perspective of what social work practice looks like. And so, it raises this question of how do we assess competency of our knowledge, our values, and our skills? For us, putting students into field placements where they can demonstrate what they do is where their skills come through. And if that's done well, can bring together that integration and synthesis of understanding of knowledge and values with actual practice. And I'm sure many of you have had students, how valuable that learning process can be. I guess the thing that comes to mind, and something that I teach my students, is that, we know this exam is flawed. We know that standardized testing is flawed from other researchers, and we are responsible for what we know, right? So where are we going to go from here as social work educators, as researchers, as clinicians and practitioners? There are many different ways to assess students. I know that as a professor in an educational environment, we have a concept called universal design from in working with the Americans with Disabilities Act approach, where we try to assess competency in different ways. Somebody might be really good at writing a paper, but somebody else might be really good at demonstrating something, and someone else might be really good at doing a presentation. And so it's really important to get these multifaceted viewpoints of their strengths, of student strengths, and of their success. And so, as I think about the exam results as a professor, I'm always wondering, how can we shift some of that approach to maybe the licensure board, right? Which gets a little trickier. We do know that our schools of social work go through a very lengthy process of accreditation through the Council on Social Work Education. It's renewed every, I believe, 7 or 8 years. The council just updated their 9 core competencies with a much heavier access on anti-racism and just practice. So we in the schools are, and most of my colleagues as well, working really hard to rise to the task placed before us to educate our students in anti-racism, to be more aware of ways that systems need to change to just be more just approaches. One thing I wanted to note, I was looking through different statements that people had put out, and I will say I read Dr. Apgar's editorial that she had in research on social work practice, and I'm glad she's going to speak to you soon. And I saw Matt DiCarlo's on here too. Matt, I read your editorial on there as well about data. So it's really good that you're both here. But one of the other things that I looked at was Dr. Catherine Potter, who's the dean at Rutgers University across the river in New Jersey. And one of the things she said is it's important to disentangle the issue of licensure from the methods used to award it. And so I guess one of the things that I think about also, and when I think about my students, is, how do we impact the way licensure is the process used to get people licensed, because there are certainly responsibilities and benefits to that, things like title protection, and certainly our accountability to the public is very important, but also not to use flawed methods to give someone that status of having a license. And so, this idea of vetting folks who want to practice professionally, licensure is done by the states, as we know. That makes it tricky, right? Doesn't mean we should just shrink away. I feel like we still are kind of called at this moment to speak up, to speak out, and to bring, some of this expertise that we might all have in ways that we know people can demonstrate that they do a good job. My mind goes off to things like, what about portfolios of practicing things that people can do to demonstrate their competence? It doesn't have to be a test that we all hated and probably didn't always, never mind, I won't even go there. But I think it's just really important to seize this moment to, now that we know we have to make some changes, we have to take some action, we maybe have to do some ownership of how we may have been complicit in these systems of oppression and racism and other things, ageism, and I think gender and wasn't it non-English ESL folks, English second language folks, also did not do as well on those exams. So those would be my my key thoughts, for greater transparency, that a test would, if it is going to involve a test, have greater validity and reliability. So I'll turn it back over to you, Johanna, and let whoever is following me have their say.
No, that was perfect, Claire, and thank you for that. And also, is a good transition to our next speaker, because you did mention her editorial, which is that we're fortunate to have with us Dawn Apgar, who has for years done trainings about taking and passing the exam, but also wrote a fantastic article, which is definitely why we wanted to, when we heard she was going to be here with us, that we were like, yes, we would absolutely welcome her participation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dawn Apgar.
Great, thank you so much. It's terrific to be among colleagues and friends. And I would just start, I think when people come out to sessions like this, we all have, story, and we're all here for our own reasons. And I can just say, I was part of New York City, I think chapter of NASW was pretty adamant about releasing the data and had done a lot of advocacy a long time ago. And I had gone to a lot of national sessions. I'm actually not surprised. I think some people are surprised. I'm actually not surprised, but what I think many people are feeling, or maybe is what I'm feeling, is that not only was there the idea that the data wasn't available, but I did sit in on sessions where there was claims made that there weren't disparities. And I think sometimes, it's more of a kind of trust issue when, people are told, no, there aren't disparities. And then, we see the data. I will just say, as a researcher, the data was released. It's very disturbing. But I also think that we need to have a greater access to the data because what I had written in my editorial is that, it's descriptive in nature. There's, we don't know we know there's intersectionality between age and gender and race, but the data wasn't analyzed in that way. And so really, I think to be useful, I'm on several national groups that are calling for the data to be released so that researchers can take a look at it and we can analyze it in a more meaningful way. I got involved, obviously people know, maybe know me from test prep, but about a year and a half ago, ASWB had committed to doing sort of a literature review and on licensure, and I was working with colleagues across the country, and we decided that we needed to publish more data and more research in the area of licensure and regulation. And so the editorial and another article that I wrote with my colleague here is appearing in a special issue of Research on Social Work Practice. And so it not only, there's actually an article about the racial disparities that was written before the data came out. So I just encourage you to, when it's out in paper, we'll publicize it, but it's most of the articles are actually online now. And a couple things. One, Dr. Dent said it very well. As an educator, I think we've all known, regardless of race, right, there's a disconnect between what we're teaching in MSW and BSW programs and the exam. And so there's a couple of articles. I wrote one called The Great Divide that said, in CSWE accredited programs, we're teaching about competency and we have these competencies, and yet ASWB uses a completely different framework. So we're not helping people necessarily in education programs, regardless of race, prepare for the exam. And there needed to be, I think, more holistic reform to try to marry those two approaches. And so when there isn't an alignment, it's not surprising that some people get left behind, and those are usually people who are marginalized and oppressed. However, I would just say, and I want to listen more than talk, but I would just say that I am a little bit nervous about this, see one group pointing the finger at the exam, another group. I think there's plenty of need for reform to go around. So this idea that education, I'm an educator, that we're doing a great job in educational programs, and it's really the exam, and we're like super inclusive, and we don't have any racial disparities and all, that would just be disingenuous. I'm excited that this is starting, I think, conversations that we need to have, both in practice. We talk about the three pillars: practice, education, and regulation. And I've been very discouraged by, this may not be particularly popular, but in practice, the idea that we are moving towards privatization of mental health services. Increasingly, social workers are going into private practice, which again marginalizes, right? People who can afford to receive services in private practices are not the people who are in agencies. So I think we're seeing, some issues there. We are also in education. The data is out. Online education has increased access for social workers of color and created greater diversity in the profession, but yet we haven't really looked, and we have to be careful that our different modalities of delivery are not creating disparate outcomes for different groups. So we also are now deciding to accredit DSW programs. We know that if you look at the data, social workers who are graduating from MSW and DSW programs, students of color are graduating with far more student debt than those who are white. And now we're adding on DSWs. And so, the question is, are we, and we also know that it's good, but that the diversity of DSW students is far greater than PhD, which I think is a good thing, but we have to be careful, to look at those outcomes and make sure that people are not incurring additional debt without the financial benefits of, what a DSW may bring. So that was something. And then I posted a session at the NASW New Jersey session with my good friend Steve Burkhart, who from Hunter, who's written a book called The End of Social Work, which I love. And he's written a lot about working conditions of social workers, unpaid internships, pro bono, the ethical mandate for social workers to do pro bono work, which is in the Code of Ethics, salary, issues. And, I'm concerned about that from a social justice perspective. So we need to look at, certainly we could talk about race, but we're predominantly also a profession of women. And so when we're talking about low salaries and poor working conditions, those have the, and unpaid internships, which those also have the ability to oppress. And then someone brought up the micro macro. As a macro person, I am concerned about the divide, and I wrote about that in that we in one article that I looked at related to specializations, I found that students of color, Black and African American, not just students, but graduates, were more likely to specialize in macro methods than white students. And yet we have far fewer resources for those students, and they don't benefit from, in many cases, licensure or which often includes increased salary. So I could go on and on, but I'll post some additional links and things like that. But what I'm excited about is certainly the test is part of it, but I would love to see this discussion go beyond just talking about the exam. That's one part of it. I have some ideas about how to reform the system without dismantling, licensure completely, because I think we have our own work to do. And I ended the editorial by just saying, what better way? We need to look at ourselves, because we can't do the important work that we need to do, the DEI work, without turning the sort of the microscope on our own profession. So I'm honored to be here with all of you.
All right, thank you so much, Dawn. Glad to have you joining us. So one thing I wanted to say, and then the remainder of our time is basically held for discussion. We do have some questions to help guide us and stimulate things, but I just wanted to fully say that, NASW, while we are not the ASWB, we are separate organizations. There is definitely a level of being complicit in, in having caused harm in this way. We probably, it almost certainly could have pushed harder at various stages for that data release when we were being blockaded. We also, we're the group who is pretty much anytime a legislative initiative gets passed relating to social work, it's going to be NASW who does it, which also puts the kind of responsibility for tackling some of this very squarely in our laps. but it also means that, we're kind of the ones who helped build this structure to begin with, that, that as licensure came about and, and we wanted to, ensure that we were being treated the same or held to the same similar standards as other mental health professionals, we all sort of flocked to this idea of like, yes, we need to guarantee competency, and we need to, and we need to have a test to ensure that competency. And that's something that we as an organization have supported and upheld for literally decades, I'm going to say. So, while, so I just have to, to express that, and I think that is being held up at the national level. National's response so far has been mostly, just a quick acknowledgement while we struggle at the national level to determine what next steps are and like how we're actually going to tackle this problem. But part of that, like discussing how to tackle this problem is, up to us at the chapters, which is why we're here today to hear from all of you about your input, your judgment, and to have like a realistic framework for discussion that, that includes all of the positives and negatives of, of any course of action, because they're all going to have consequences one way or the other. We just have to make sure that whatever path we pursue is the one that's going to, both advance the greatest good and to, bring equity at levels where it's needed. So having said that, I'm gonna throw out the first question, and then our other discussion leaders can take it from there with throwing out further questions as we go. But we wanted to get started with just, how are you guys doing? And during all of this, we want to ensure that we're holding space for the people who have been impacted by this at the greatest levels, whether that be, as I said, via age or gender, or certainly the vast differences that we saw in the data on the question of like race, ethnicity, English as a second language, like that sort of thing. But just to start out with, again, how are you feeling about all of this, and how has the release of this data impacted you?
I'll start us off. So when this data first came out, I will honestly say, and I agree with Dawn, that this is not surprising. I think this is something that those of us in this field, especially those of us of color, have experience with, either taking the test multiple times, having to put our mind frame into something completely different versus what we do in practice. And so what I mean by that is that when I sit down to take that examination, I'm not taking it as a Black woman social worker. I have to put my mind frame into being a white woman social worker, because that is how the test is framed. And so this information coming out, again, was not surprising. But one thing I think it does, if I look at this from a positive way, is that it's actually starting a conversation where we can change the progression of social work to a more positive field, a more inclusive field. I have sat in rooms over the past few weeks where this is a topic of conversation when people are talking about social workers, talking about the results. What does the results mean for the profession of social work? Part of that discussion as well is educating people on what social work is, right? So what's the difference between BSW, MSW, LSW, LCSW? Because we are such a versatile field that a lot of people don't really understand what it means to be a social worker. And that kind of adds to, how do you measure a competent social worker? I am an unlicensed social worker. That does not mean that I am not competent. It just means that me getting licensed will not, one, higher my pay rate. It's actually going to cost me more to maintain my license. than it would to actually help me in my field. And so when we are advocating for social workers to get licensed, because it's a better way of tracking social workers, we also need to look at what is the benefit of that licensure test? What is the benefit of other pathways, and how do we measure that? So for me, I think this is a very exciting time. It may not seem exciting, but I think this is a very exciting time because people are starting to talk about this, and this is a time for social workers to kind of capitalize on these conversations and kind of let the world know who social workers are and kind of change the trajectory of this exam and creating other pathways. If you would like to share, I would say raise your hand just so we can make sure that we are catching everyone, okay? But James, I see you're unmuted, so you can go.
Yeah, I had a question because something you said at the very beginning really hit me. And I want to, and I've had these conversations in various ways in the past. So I want to ask if you could help me as a white male understand your experience in that testing environment when you have to shift your mindset from being a Black woman social worker, which is who you are, and all the wisdom and wealth of experience that brings with it, into the box, the artificial box of the exam, and having to think like a white woman social worker. Can you help me as a white male? Can you operationalize that a little bit more and help me try to begin to understand the pieces of that?
So the best way to answer that would be surrounding the questions that usually have to do with child welfare. So usually Child Protective Services. So for example, if a question, and I'm making this off the top of my head, so if someone actually has taken the test recently and has a question that they would like to share, please let me know. But let's say, for example, the test is asking the question of, a mother is struggling to feed her children, keep the lights on, struggling with parenting. What would you do in this instance, right? And so me, as a Black woman working in some of the poorest neighborhoods, I am going to educate this mother. We are going to work together so that not only can she keep her children in the home, but she learns how to create a functional family system. The test is not going to say that. The test is going to say that I need to report that mother. And so that's what I mean when I have to switch my brain, taking all of my experience, all of my knowledge, and taking all of that and putting it aside, because what I would do in the real world is not what the test is telling me I should do. That also adds to when we talk about disproportionately Black and brown families being reported to Child Protective Services over white families. So this is, it's not just a linear, or not a linear, it's not just like a one-off question. This adds to the entire system of social work. This adds to the entire system of Child Protective Services, that someone taking that test, they're going to answer that question. They may get it right. They go into the field, they're working with this family, and then they report that family, because that we know statistically, Black and brown families are reported at a much higher rate than white families.
That's helpful, because that's one of the things I and other faculty can speak to this who are closer to the issue, that I always struggle with in class and in supervision, is balancing exactly that question of how do you actually respond in those environments, understanding the challenges families are facing due to economics, race, ethnicity, culture, etc. And having that awareness when the system forces you to look at something else that may or may not be as valuable in that moment. So that's really helpful to me. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
May I speak? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, Sierra. That example was very helpful. It's been about 20 years since I took the exam. So I don't remember a lot from it, but I was especially interested in hearing about these results because I'm a supervisor, and I don't know, and not intentionally, maybe by chance, but all of the people that I supervise so far have been Black women. So I'm really interested to know, what's going into this and where things are going to go from here.
So for any of our participants who are still on, obviously all of you are still on, but anybody who has recently taken the exam or who has that exam kind of in their future as they pursue licensure, or who has the experience of having failed the exam, especially if you're able to share kind of what your experiences have been, or how this whole situation impacts your view or your perspective.
Joanna, you might want to, so the question, do you mind if I clarify the question?
Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. I had to switch screens. So overall, the question that we're asking is, what has been your experience with preparing and taking the exam?
I see Dawn's hand up.
I was going to answer the other question. So,
Okay.
just as somebody
The other one about more experiences and perspectives and all of that.
We did a similar, town hall in New Jersey, and I would just say a lot of what I've heard is people saying, it's not me, or feeling that they're not, alone, because it can be very isolating, right? When you're taking the test and if you're not passing and you're feeling like, oh, is it me? Or I don't know someone, or what am I doing wrong? I did the best. And so those are I would just say the kinds of things that I've heard from people who have shared their stories after, this idea of, I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm.
I see Holly's hand up. Thank you, Dawn. Holly, you'll have to unmute yourself. Or we might have to help her unmute. There we go. Oh, maybe not.
Nope. Ask to un.
We can't hear you yet, Holly. Hold on 1 second. Oh, there you go. You should be unmuted.
Okay. I just took the CSWB test twice within the last 6 weeks. I failed by 9 questions, studied really hard again, failed it by 8 questions. And it's just baffling because I've been in the social work field for 20 years. I'm my LSW for 20 years, and I'm really confused and honestly disoriented on what the test is looking for, because you're right, it doesn't test my competency. And when I try to reflect the test to the content, I scratch my head and feel like no matter what answer I give, it's still wrong, regardless of my studying, my experience. And it's kind of like poke and hope, and maybe I get their answer right, which to me is totally unethical and not representative of my skills and capabilities.
Thank you, Holly. Mercedes, I saw your name next, or your hand up.
Yes, hi, everyone. Just a thought, I completed my MSW in 2019. I did take the test at the time, and I failed the test for like 2 questions, which the numbers were odd because I took it again in February this year and I passed, and I actually ended up getting less right questions than I did at that time, and I still passed. So I don't remember exactly, but at that time, I think I got 99 out of 101 questions right. This time I got 98 and I passed. So at the time I thought it's because English is not my native language. So and I had just finished the program, so I didn't necessarily have as much experience. But recently I took the test, but what I found was that all my experience so far has been clinical. I have my own caseload, so I clients one-to-one. So I don't do case management in the, like at this time. So I found that the test did require a lot of case management knowledge, at least the LSW, which is the one I took. And I found that I had to study more for that rather than using my own skills that that I've gathered from being like working clinically with clients.
Yeah, I believe, and I'm gonna have to phone a friend on this. I think it was 2018 is whenever the exam changed for the weighing of the LSW and the LCSW exam to be different in different categories. So did you take your first test prior to 2018?
2019.
2019. Yeah, so it would have been weighed differently, I believe, then. And Karen?
Yes, so I'm going to preface this by saying I did take my test 20 years ago because I graduated in 2001 and I took it shortly after I graduated. But I specifically remember being told that you have to, quote, think like the test writers. And like all the preparation courses and everything that I took were geared toward having us think the way the people who wrote the exam did, not even necessarily being relevant to practice. So I thought that was interesting. I did not pass the first time. I attributed it to nerves, test anxiety, because I don't like standardized tests. I prefer short answers and essays. The second time I was much more confident and wasn't as nervous. So this information is just very fascinating to me.
Thank you for your feedback.
Sure.
I'm looking to see, do we have any other hands up?
I don't see hands up, but I do kind of want to call on someone. Like I saw actually Matt DiCarlo mentioned that a lot of people have reached out to him. So I wondered, Matt, if you were willing to share a little bit.
Johanna, there is still one hand up.
I was about to say, we have one hand.
Okay, I wanted to respond actually to both questions about how we've been affected by the tests and our experience with the test. I have actually just recently retired, but I've been boots on the ground in social work, working all the time with families on medical assistance. I have not been in private practice. And there's a big difference in the state of Pennsylvania of people on medical assistance. It doesn't matter whether you have an LCSW or an LSW until recently, and the pandemic really seemed to get a focus on mental health competency. And there was a slight, not a huge raise, but there was a slight raise in my pay last year because of that. But I also don't know how many people aren't in the profession and why there is such a hard time. My most recent experience was doing in-home services for families with special needs, and how many people don't get into that because they can't pass the test. I'm not in human resources, but I just wonder that, and I'm sure that the pay has something to do with it because I am not a millionaire on what I made through my life. So that's one thing. That I took the test for the LCSW, I think 2010. I found a lot of the answers. I felt like it was the diaper answer. It depends. It depends on what this situation. It depends on that. So and I'm a white social worker, and I still found a lot of those questions very ambiguous and very hard. And one last comment I want to make is several of you, if we're really trying to look at microaggressions and language that we use, several people have used English as a second language, and my experience is it's been their fourth or fifth language. And I think English as another language is much more appropriate.
Makes sense. There's some good discussion going on in the chat. Sierra or Kristie, is there anything we want to lift out of that from what we're seeing?
I think so. Let me go back into it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing too. I'm scanning. Excellent chat section, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was paying attention to the conversation. So I know, so Jonathan, I'm gonna actually go back to your question and save that for last, because I think that's also important to note. But I wanna at least hit some of these other ones that are in the chat. So I think Catherine talks about taking the prep classes. So when I took a prep class as well, it was kind of the same way, where it was like, if the question reads this way, this is kind of how you answer, but not necessarily testing my knowledge about social work. And so that was my first kind of light bulb that went off, where it was like, okay, this is just like every standardized test I have ever taken, that where it's not really measuring, am I competent, but measuring, do I know how to take this test? So to add to that, I think Valerie asked a really good question, well, questions. So do we know who the test writers are? How are they selected? Is it made up of our profession who are reflective of the social work field? Does anyone on this call possibly know insight into that? Claire?
I can't speak.
I have some insight. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Although I feel like others may know as well. Actually, kind of when I remember from when we were kind of advocating for and asking for this data about, you know, and kind of suspecting that there may be some disparity, when it was shared that, you know, when folks were kind of telling us like, no, there's no disparity, one of the things that was always highlighted was like, no, it's definitely not, you know, a discriminatory or biased test, because we have plenty of people who are question writers, you know, from a diverse background, you know, which doesn't necessarily mean the test is, you know, biased or non-biased, but it is definitely a factor. So the test takers are, the test writers are selected. I think every year there's an email that goes out from ASWB. We have from NASW, we have passed on that email or the text of that in our you know, in our e-news or through our other channels when we've had the opportunity, so that, you know, we get folks from Pennsylvania to you know, to sign up. You go through like once you like submit your application as a question writer, you go through like a training session with ASWB. And then I think you basically get paid per question. Like you write a question, and if it's accepted, you know, and you get assigned like that you're supposed to submit X number of questions, and out of those, you know, they like only a percentage of them will get chosen for testing. Then at that point, then it goes to like, you know, that when you take the exam, only most of the test actually counts for you. Some of the questions that are on there are sample test questions, and they're evaluating like, you know, how many people get that question right, like other, you know, comments, etc. Before a question actually like makes it into circulation as like an official scored question. I think there is a part of at least what I've seen in some of the responses has been like a call for greater transparency in the test, you know, in the test development process, and ensuring, you know, it like more ensuring like diversity of test takers. But that is one of those things that ASWB did brag about, was that their test writers were already fairly diverse. So that's what I know about it. I don't know if others on this call may have more to share. But yeah, that's at least the perspective of somebody from, you know, from a NASW executive director perspective, and what I've seen and heard over the years.
I see we have two hands up. I think James was first, and then so go ahead, James.
Yeah, so just to add to what Joanna has shared, you can apply to be an ASWB item test writer. It's a contract. You will be paid $1,500 for 30 questions that they select. I was going to go for it a couple of years ago, and then the time commitment that was going to require for me, I decided not to pursue it. So the people have to be practicing social workers. They must be degreed social workers. But I think the issue that we have that I would put out, and I don't know if Tanya, you can speak to this, or maybe Dawn can speak to this for someone else. The thing I always wonder about these types of opportunities is a matter of self-selection. You have to have the time available in order to write these questions. And that self-selects to certain social workers in certain practice environments, which I then think also has a correlation to certain ethnicities, et cetera. It's just, I have no data to support that, but that's just experience talking and looking at the field. And I'm wondering if that is also part of this problem, that it's skewed toward a certain demographic of the social work profession, which then results in these data discrepancies that we are now finally seeing, which we've all kind of innately and intuitively known are there.
Thanks, James. LaTanya?
Thank you. So I'm a social work student, and I'll be done in December, and I'm studying for my LSW. And while I'm a student, I'm not young, so I have a lot of lived experiences. And one of the things that I am hearing is that this is really cyclical in nature, in that we are opening up the test writing to people who are diverse, and yet at the same time, there's a certain format we have to follow in order to have those questions selected in order to be paid for those, which means that there is already a set standard that is of the majority culture. Let me rephrase that, not majority culture, because that's not necessarily true, of the culture that has the control over the testing standards, right? So if that be the case, then it doesn't matter if the pool of writers are diverse, if the standards themselves of how the questions have to be asked, and if the questions don't take into consideration the experiences of other cultures, it's not going to be diverse. We're still at the same point where we were before. The second thing that I think about is someone mentioned about having to study preparatory workshops. And I've done those too. And what I've noticed a lot of times is that those too are the experiences of cultures that are not necessarily the marginalized communities. But the experiences that social workers tend to get are those from those communities that are marginalized. So you go in to a marginalized community, you do your social work thing, but none of that work then gets replicated or gets placed into the teaching standards, the examples that are used for testing or anything like that. It still remains lopsided. So it's just a circle. It's like, oh yeah, but we have these people. Yeah, and you still didn't change the standards. Oh, but we include this. Yeah, but these experiences aren't taken into consideration. So until we realize that the experiences of the folks that we are working with are valid and important, and this is actually what we do every day, we're going to be in the same boat, having the same conversation coming up in the next 15 years. Thank you.
No, thank you. Do we see any other hands up? I believe now I'm getting it was either Joanna's question or Sierra's question that we were going to have.
Wade
Matt.
has his, one second. Wade
Yep,
has
go
his
ahead,
hand
Wade.
raised.
Yep.
Everyone, how are you? So let's see, we have two computers here, so I'm getting feedback. Go ahead. Sorry. Okay, is that better? You can hear me? Okay, yeah. So, Dawn had me take two 175 question tests and two 50 question tests. I am still traumatized by that. I don't know how I took that test in silence when I had to do it because I was cursing the whole time at both Dawn and the test. They were pretty ridiculous, really, because they give you 4 choices. Which one would you do first? And, as an experienced social worker, and this is why I think older social workers don't do as well, I do all 4 of them. I do all 4 of them at once. So I think there should be an obvious answer for one. And, one of the things that we measured is that our competencies that we're teaching in the classroom do not match the test. And so there's going to be failure there just because of that. There's an article that came out in 2019 by Castex, who looked at the test and said they had bias. Now, they didn't have the test because they didn't give it out, but again, it was a practice test. And so they had questions that had ethnic identifiers. And so one of the things that they said was, take the ethnic identifiers out. But in the same breath, they said, we have to teach cultural competence. So it's a little bit incongruent as how are we going to test students and people taking the test about cultural competence, yet in the exam, we're supposed to leave the identifiers out. And so I think that has to be rectified. Before I left today from the college where I'm at, I talked to a nursing professor who knows about their test, and they did in fact do that. They took the ethnic identifiers out. So instead of saying a 41-year-old Latino male, it just says a 41-year-old male. And so their thinking is, one, take that out because it confuses things. But the other thing is, it doesn't matter what the ethnicity is, it's the same treatment. Now, part of me knows that's not true, right? Because we also know there's healthcare disparities and people are a little bit different. But, maybe just as a way of not confusing the test, maybe we need to begin to think about taking that part out. And hopefully we're teaching cultural competence in our classrooms and they're getting it. But maybe, I don't know, I feel terrible saying this, maybe not testing on it and taking those identifiers out and having each question that's asked on the test looked at by a diverse group of people to see if there's a bias in the question. Because although they have people of color who are doing the questions now, that's a change. They're still mixed in with the questions that people of the majority, as I think was the term, they also are still mixed in there. And so the test is just a mix of that. And so I think the whole test needs to be looked at. I hope I made sense just now.
You did. Thanks, Wade. Kiana.
Hi, everyone. I put a bunch of things in the chat. Please feel free to take a look at them because I think they are all important. And it really, for me, kind of sets the tone of why I'm saying get rid of the test completely. Okay. So the first thing is I talked with Wade a couple of weeks or a couple of days ago, and we were just talking about, some of the things that we've seen in the test. And so I pulled up a test question that I had taken from Dr. Lewis a couple of days ago, who did there was a program on how do you talk to students about the ASWB test, right? And so she had this presentation up and she pulled up one of the things that's also in the chat, you can see it. And it has a question there, and the question really is degrading in so many different ways. And as you look at the question, ASWB says, oh, the answer is A, right? But from a Black perspective, someone who is identified as an African-American person, that is not the answer that I would give because it's inappropriate. So if you all want to just take a look at that really quickly to see what I'm talking about, just so that you have a better understanding. That's what we mean when we say it's more than just bias. We need to get rid of the test, period, right? Because one, the language is outdated. And we would never look at someone and say, oh my goodness, this person has substance use disorder because they proclaimed to us that they were drinking the night before or something. We would never do that, right? And so if that's the case and we're having questions like this, then social workers who are being trained in this way, when they go out into the field, this is the way they are working with folks from the marginalized community. This is the way that they think about them. In turn, it impacts how they support them when it comes to treatment. It impacts how they support them when they're talking to them one-on-one. It impacts how they're working with them when they're writing documentation person and what the language says about them, right? And so this is why we have this new thing where clients are now able to see their documentation, and folks are like, well, I don't want folks to see my documentation. Why? What are you saying about them in the documentation that's problematic, that you feel that you have to sit down with them to express what you're saying about them in the documentation? And so my whole stance on this is that we need to get rid of it, right? We can't keep trying to do new things with old ways. We either have to say we want to be anti-racist and incorporate these anti-racist practices that CSWE is talking about, or we want to act like we're being anti-racist, have this test as a justification of, are you a competent social worker or not? We can't do both. And so I love that we're having this conversation, but I really, really hope today we really start to like push the envelope, NASW included, all of the folks on the call included, that we really start to really push this conversation to our legislators about what we need to do about this. We can't keep having the same, because NABSW has been having this conversation for 40 years. It's well documented. So we need to step up to the plate. If we're saying that we want to include anti-racist curriculum and have that, connection between the school and practice, then we need to actually do that, right? Because students are watching us. They're hearing us. They see what we're saying and they see what we're doing. And then we wonder why we don't have a lot of student participation in NASW, because look at what we're doing. We've waited how many weeks to give a response about this when we knew it was an issue before. So we can't keep being complacent this way. I know I'm not going to continue to be complacent. I'm going to talk to my students about what's happening. I'm going to talk to my students about how to advocate for themselves when it comes to this. And even as someone who, I'm getting ready to take the test in November, and I feel conflicted. I know that if I take the test, it's going to be a pathway for me to have more pay equity, to be able to support my family. But also in the same way, I know that there's a chance that I may not even pass it on the first try. And so that $240 that I'm getting ready to pay for this test with, I could be spending that on a bill, childcare, or something else. And so we really have to start looking at this from a structural perspective, a socioeconomic perspective. It's not just about the test being biased. It's literally 40 years. How many missed opportunities have Black and folks of color missed? We wonder why there's such a pay gap. This is part of the reason why. And so I'll get off my soapbox. Please take a look at the resources I put inside the chat. They are all from well-known folks, organizers who are doing this work on the ground. Again, Dr. Lewis, Shimon Cohen, who has the podcast. Who else? I don't want to name everybody. You can all see them there. Matt DiCarlo is there as well. So thank you to all the people who are continuing to have this conversation and not letting it go. So I really appreciate that.
Kiana, how are we supposed to follow up after you?
That's why I waited so long. That's why I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to say what they wanted.
How are we? Thank you so much for your comments. And I see there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat. So I do want to go to LaTanya, and then James, and then we're going to address the ones in the chat, and then we're going to move to the next question. I appreciate the discussion, but I do want to try and get through some of the other questions that we have. So LaTanya?
Yeah, I want to go back to Wade's comment about taking identifiers off of the exam. I understand the position, but I'm conflicted about whether or not that should be a thing. Only because if you're talking about me as an individual, you can't separate me from who I am, my identity, and my culture. So, and how you deal with me as a Black female mother, twice divorced, is going to be totally different from how you deal with a white female mother, twice divorced, right? Even if our situations are the same, our lived experiences are different, right? And so that identifier of who I am, Black female, my culture, maybe even if you want to talk about religion, takes a part in how we formulate what to do with individuals or how to assist individuals in their situation. Because all of that, as we learn, impacts the decisions that they make and how they respond to whomever is talking to them, offering assistance. Now, maybe because I'm coming into this I'm a little, green and shaded, but that's what I'm seeing. And that's one thing that I thought about when that was mentioned. And if I'm off base and if I'm misunderstood, please let me know. The other thing is, I don't know about about getting rid of the test altogether. And I know that's not going to sit well with some folks. Only reason is because we do have to have a measure. Although that measure needs to be fair and equitable, right? But we have to have a measure. I don't know if I would take my kid in to see a surgeon and ain't had no boards and ain't passed nothing. I don't know if I want nobody working on my heart if you ain't been through nothing and you can't tell me you know something. Granted, there may be some other situations that may be going on that reflect the type of service that I get, hidden racism, biases, and all that kind of stuff. But I want to be able to see that you have some credentials to be able to tell me about what's going on with me. And I think that while the system needs to change and we need to have some drastic changes about what the test looks like, I don't know if I would get rid of that test. I don't know. That's just me. And again, that could be my greenness. Thank you.
Thank you, LaTanya. Before I go to you, James, I still see your hand raised. The idea of getting rid of the test is something that I think has been passed around a lot. There has been other chapters in other states, actually I only know of one, where they did get rid of the, if I'm not mistaken, the LSW test exam. So yes, it's Illinois, yeah. Oh, so in Rhode Island, thanks. So I don't know where I stand on that, because I think I agree with both Kiana and I both agree with LaTanya, and that's why we're having this conversation, to kind of see where we should go as a chapter to kind of address what everyone is feeling right now. And so it's okay to have different opinions. We're all not going to agree, but I do think having this conversation is the start of some advocacy work that the chapter would like to do moving forward. And so we don't really know if that's going to be, you know, taking away the test or keeping it, but I do think the start of this conversation is going to be very, very helpful. James?
Yeah. So as some of you know me and know that I have a reputation of stepping in where angels tend to know better to go. So, Sierra, to respond to your question, I have no problem following into Kiana's comments. For those who don't know me, I'm a forensic social worker, just so you know the context of my comments I'm about to make. My practice is an expert witness, working with attorneys in response to malpractice claims against predominantly social workers. So I have quite a bit of experience dealing with situations where social workers have been sued for malpractice on both sides of the plaintiff defense arena. So I'm speaking from that perspective involving wrongful death, boundary, ethics, fraud, etc. So just kind of having set that stage, I do think it would be exceptionally dangerous to completely get rid of the test, because we need a standard by which society has some assurance that the person they're seeing is competent, has met some objective standard, and can provide them the care that they are asserting and promising that they can provide, which is also an ethical standard in our code. I do agree the current test needs to be revised. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be changed. It's not measuring what we clearly needed and wanted to measure. But I think it'd be very, very dangerous. It would set the profession back if we were to remove the test and have nothing to replace it by which to assert to society, yes, we are a profession. Yes, we are competent. And yes, you can have some assurance that the person you're seeing as a social worker has gone through certain training and has met a certain standard. Now, I think, and here, you and I have had this conversation, I think, and I've had it with a couple of other folks here. The test needs to be broadened so that someone who's dealing in policy should not be taking the same test as a clinical social worker. The skill set, while similar, is very, very different and needs to have a different measurement and standard by which you are saying you are competent to be working in that specialty practice area. So that's one issue. The other issue in terms of getting rid of the test and not being able to demonstrate that you have an LCSW or in some jurisdictions an LICSW, a lot of federal regulations, state regulations, and insurance contracts require you to have that license. So without it, we're shooting ourselves in the foot as a profession. We're setting ourselves back decades when we should be looking at a way to secure ourselves as professionals alongside of physicians, psychiatrists, and nurses. So yeah, I think this is a valuable discussion. We need to change this test, but not get rid of it. We need to figure out what's wrong with it and correct it. Now, maybe that does require tossing the whole thing out and starting from scratch. that's the discussion we need to have. But we need some standard by which we can say to society, yeah, we're competent and we are a profession.
Thanks, James. Kiana?
I'm sorry, my computer did something crazy. I'm not sure, and not crazy in that way. I want to go back to something James said in the chat about what do we have instead. I saw a post a couple of days ago, and it was on Twitter, and it was coined by the dope Black social worker who basically said, at one point we were operating without the license. I know social workers who were practicing who said, we didn't have the license 40 years ago, 30 years ago. I didn't have to do that, right? And so there was a time when we were operating without the license. Another part to that is, what is the purpose of us having CSWE accreditation? What's the purpose of that? Because if the purpose is to say you went to an accredited university, a college, or what have you, then that should be enough. And many people will not agree with me on this because guess what? It's about money. That's what this is about. ASWB has $33 million or $3.3 million. They're not just going to give it up. They're not just going to let it go. But at what cost? So it's 33. At what cost? How many social workers are not being able to practice because they can't pass the test? And as Matt just pointed out a few moments ago, do we really trust ASWB to revise and resubmit? No. They've already lied. They lied and said they didn't have the data. They lied and said they don't collect the data. And then they put the data out and skewed it in a way so that if people are not statisticians, you couldn't really read it. So then we have ethical concerns in this, which I don't hear a lot of people talking about. That's a huge problem. If we're going to keep talking about this, then we need to start talking about what are some actionable steps. Like let's move beyond this conversation. We know it has impacted people. We know it is inherently racist. What are we doing now? That's the question. I'm sorry, Sierra, I don't want to take over your questions. But what are we doing now?
I appreciate it, Kiana. So to answer that direct question, I was saving for the end to tell you guys what the chapter plan is. But right now we're still just letting people kind of vent and answer these questions. But at the end, I will save to at least let you guys know and be transparent what are the actual steps that the chapter is going to be taking to address this.
I will also throw in there that I feel like this is sort of a natural transition to the next question, because I feel like we've already been kind of circling around this for a few minutes now, which is that the question is like, well, what is your perspective about what we should be doing? Mm-hmm. And so I want to throw out a couple of things, just, kind of for consideration as we start that discussion, that I assume maybe other folks may bring up anyway, but it is a complicated question, because doesn't not only involve the what do we truly stand for equity, and are we going to take the steps to address that equity in a real manner, but everything that we do also is impacted by our legislature and the legislative environment that we operate in. And there's a lot of states out there, and I'll say that Pennsylvania is not immune from that we may not be able to, we don't operate in the same kind of legislative environment that they have in Rhode Island, for example. And there's having participated in a lot of national discussions from chapter executives, there's a lot of us who are concerned about that if we open up our licensure law and try to remove the exam, that, that a anti-regulation legislature, which a lot of those, Republican legislatures tend to be, will just strip will take that opportunity to strip social work of licensure entirely, because we opened our licensure law up for consideration. There's also, I heard like another random thing to bring up from the chats that I've like participated in is that there have been other EDs who have heard like directly from schools or faculty members, and I would be interested in the perspective of some of the faculty members we have on this call, you know, who have been pressured into keeping students in their program for the tuition money, kind of despite whether they feel like that person is not a fit for the profession. And we're active, you know, so faculty members or programs who have actively tried to, you know, throw somebody out of the social work major just to be told no by their administration, and to be told by that same administration that they would be kept from practicing because, you know, if they're not a fit for the profession, then they wouldn't be able to pass the exam, which I see as highly problematic anyway, because that means you're, you know, taking money from that person for tuition for a profession that they, for a degree that they inevitably won't necessarily be able to use. You know, those are some of the random things I want to throw out there that haven't like been a part of this conversation yet. You know, that gatekeeping aspect and like the legislative environment that many of us work in, you know, that all have to be factors of consideration when we talk about what our approach is. And at some point I can kind of share a little bit of the, you know, because there's nothing final yet, but I can share a little bit of the like kind of what at least is being talked about at the national level. You know, again, like knowing that that's not final, but so anyway, with that, with those additional factors being discussed, would like to throw it out to the group again to just sort of talk about like, what do you think we should, you know, that we should do, both at the larger level of like, where should we go as a profession as a whole in addressing this situation, and at the small specific level of like me as NASW chapter executive director, and Sierra and Kristie as president and president-elect. You know, what, yeah, so anything from that macro, like society level to the micro, like, you know, Johanna, Sierra, and Kristie, you should kind of discussions.
So Margaret, your hand's not raised, but I saw you moving your hand, so. You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
There we go. There we go. I got it. Yeah, I had to step away for a few minutes. I'm a retired faculty member, and I also do direct practice. And I want to say that I agree with both sides in this. I agree 100% that if we're going to be a profession, there has to be a standard. And there are so many professions out there that want nothing more than to own what we do. We've already historically given away so much. And there are things that other professions have seized that social work developed. So to give up the exam completely would be to open up that licensure law and give it up. There are so many people out there that want to grab and seize what we do, and we won't get it back. So social work cannot step away 100%. On the other hand, the exam, and I was there when they developed the very first exam. I'm that old, okay? But they developed the exam by talking with a lot of social workers. It's as biased as it could be. The people talking about bias, it couldn't be any more biased. If they tried, I mean, that's a correct exact formula for how to create a very biased exam. And social work, the exam is trying to do too much. Instead of defining a narrow core of knowledge that every social worker must have, and bringing the diversity in at that level, bringing the diversity into defining what knowledge is absolutely essential, and then making sure that we teach that knowledge, because the colleges don't, when you see how they teach, it's terrible. A lot of professors are up there on their soapbox and they're not teaching the core knowledge. The students are not being required to have that knowledge. They're doing group projects where one person does all the work and the other ones get the grade with them, and they're writing all kinds of papers. They think memorizing is a bad thing. And yet an exam cannot accurately and unbiasedly measure how we apply the knowledge. That's it. That's where the diversity comes in. So the exam's trying to do way too much. It's trying to not just measure knowledge, but it's trying to measure how we apply the knowledge. Well, if we brought the diversity into defining a set of core knowledge and then trusted the education process, trusted the degree to, and then let the diversity come into play in how the knowledge is applied. I think the exam's trying to do way too much, and it's trying to do something it cannot possibly do. And the way it was developed, you couldn't have a worse formula for developing a non-biased exam. If you wanted to write how to develop a biased exam, they followed that process. So I agree with, I see both sides of it. Whatever you do, don't give up the exam. Do not reopen that licensing law, because there are 100 professions out there that want to seize and own what we do. We already work in so many host settings where we are groveling to people from other professions and other disciplines, and we're not allowed to be a social worker. So we've got to hold on to the professionalism, and that I'm not just saying the professionalism as we practice, but we've got to hold on to that societal sanction. We let that go, we're done. Good intentions aren't enough, but we have to change. We have to change how the exam, what they're defining as core knowledge, because CSWE is all over the place. It's too much. You know, I mean, we could carry students out on stretchers. The expectations are too high. We can't be everything to everyone. And that's it. I'm done. I still don't know how to put my hand up, by the way. See,
Thank you, Margaret.
What?
So thank you, Margaret.
Okay, I still don't know, so I'm done. I won't talk again.
James?
So I'll be very, very succinct. I think if I understand the question, it's from our perspective, what do we recommend that the chapter pursues as the next step? I'd recommend 4 things. Organize a task force of social work members to examine the issue and recommend actions to the chapter and to the board. 2, that should result in a very clear policy statement from NASW-PA that is formalized and published. 3, we need to partner, once we have that policy statement established, with other state chapters on this issue, particularly state chapters whose also positions are congruent with whatever the chapter comes up with. 4, and finally, once that is together, we've built a coalition of other chapters, then advocate for national to form a formal position on this issue that is congruent with the majority of chapters. That'd be what I would recommend in terms of a next step.
Thanks, James. Matt?
Oh, there was so much in Margaret's response that I loved. But yeah, I think just we got into a little bit on exam development, and I've been doing some research on that specifically. And I think it's important just for me to highlight how bad of a job ASWB does as methodologists. The standards that they apply. So like Margaret's critique, totally good. Even if they tried to do it right, it would still be bad, but they still don't actually do the standards that they're supposed to. They're supposed to be testing for bias at the test level. They don't do that. They're supposed to share the data that Dawn is talking about. They don't do that. And at national level, on a state level, social workers have let this happen for far too long. They used to say in their candidate handbook that their exams were statistically free of race and gender bias, which they dirty deleted this summer when the data finally didn't support that. And they are only acknowledging causes of that disparity that are unrelated to the exam. They like it's insane to me just to, like as a research methods instructor to just like sit here and be like, so you're gonna not pretend that like differential test functioning is like a thing and like it exists in the world, and it's just nuts, man. So I just at least want to, I definitely get the idea of an exam is necessary, but I think that it is absolutely imperative that we create an exam immediately that can replace it, because the interstate compact is going to not only build in the clinical exam, but also the LMSW and the LBSW exams as well.
Thank you, Matt. Kiana, you did have your hand raised. Did you? Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought it was still raised. The first thing, so I agree with James, but I feel like a lot of times in NASW, we've been in positions where policies or changes or things are starting to be discussed, and it really leaves out folks who are not NASW members. And this is not just impacting NASW members, it's impacting all social workers. So we're going to have a conversation about those that are most harmed and most marginalized, who are literally failing this exam because of the exam. Then we need to have those voices at the table, whether they're paying NASW members or not. That's number one. And number two, I really think we have to start getting the students involved in this. They are going to be taking that LBSW exam. They're going to be taking all of these exams. We need to have their advocacy. We need to have their voices, because if we don't, it's literally going to be just us all the time talking about what we could do, when students really can produce that movement that we're looking for. It can't just be us. So I would really start to have this conversation with students, letting them know what's happening, and really getting them involved about, you know, this entire test situation. Those are the only two things I got right now.
Thanks, Kiana. Dawn?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to take time, and but I think there's some things that we could do right now, and those include, without legislation, those include waiving retesting fees. That could be literally implemented tomorrow. If someone's retesting, they wouldn't have to pay, or there would be some sort of, reduced fee. So that's something that could literally tomorrow, if we had the mobilization, ASWB could waive their retesting fees. The online practice test, which is $85, it's a flat file, it's there. So literally that could be made available for free, just by allowing people, right, in the cart, making it 0, not 85. So I think there are some things, again, the bigger issue of recreating a test, or should we be testing? Those things are all great, but there are some the data is available. Like, it could be released tomorrow, and I'm a little concerned, because I'm in some groups where it's like, I just heard from a group, oh, CSWE is analyzing the data right now. Like, there's people who have access to that data. I'm not sure who, but I think there are, we should start with the low hanging fruit, and then, look at the bigger systemic issues. But I think we could do things right now.
I love those ideas. Thank you, Dawn. And in the chat as well.
I do want to go back to the chat. You guys have been typing away, so we are like really behind on that. But I did see some really good questions from Lance, from Val. Where were they?
I think they're higher up a little bit there. I was trying to.
They're higher. Okay.
Yeah.
Would Val and Lance like to come off, because I cannot see the questions, and just ask what you put in the chat?
Eating my salad, Sierra.
I'm sorry.
I'm really curious about so what is the historical context? Because to be honest with you, I don't know anything about how the ASWB came to be, how they got assigned as the folks who are running the test, how they're related to any other social work organization. I think there's just a lot of structural context there. I'm certainly missing it. I don't know if other folks are missing that as well, but sort of who crowned them king of testing, I guess, is a good question that I have.
I can't necessarily answer all of that. Like I am pretty sure that predates me, so I don't know who crowned them king of testing. I can talk a little bit about like what the ASWB actually is. So for context, so it is the Association of State Social Work Boards. So the members of ASWB are all of the like 50, I don't know, I'm going to say including like DC and Virgin Islands and Guam and places like that, probably like 55, 56 or so different, licensing boards. And that includes like the staff. It also includes those of us who have composite boards like we do in Pennsylvania, where it's not just the social work board, it's the board of social work, professional counseling and marriage and family therapy. And then is headed by a national staff. So like things that they've done, because they are kind of the association of basically all of the licensing boards together, was that they drafted like the model licensing laws that a lot of NASW chapters then took and worked to get them drafted as and established in order to ensure regulation. That was kind of what I was referring to close to, in the beginning when I said we all ran to this level of licensure and this structure and model of licensure without necessarily having the knowing that that it involves some of what Peg was talking about earlier, and James with ensuring our professionalism and our credentialing next to other professions. But I think one of those things about the ASWB exam is there, as far as I know, and what has been brought up at national discussions that I've been participating in, is that there is no specific data to support that somebody who has passed the exam has any better outcome or competence than someone who has not. And at the very least, I can completely get behind the idea that we need to verify competence and to have some level of credentialing to say that competence and gatekeeping and all of that is a thing. But it should be based on data to say that, there's some kind of evidence that passing the test improves that competence or reduces the risk of malpractice or, something like that. So again, I assume that somewhere along the line, they got the job of actually producing that test. I can say this, and again, this is entirely my perspective as Johanna, not representative of the Pennsylvania chapter of the National Association of Social Workers or anything like that. But I personally feel like there has been a significant level of mission drift within ASWB, and that their stated purpose and objective of protecting the profession has kind of become more driven by the profit behind administering the exam and or the resources they get for helping folks prepare for the exam. And I'm not an insider as far as I've never been to their board meetings. I've never, I've gone to one conference of theirs 10 years ago. So I'm not speaking from an insider, but that is definitely the way that it feels to me.
So one of the reasons I'm asking that question is because of accountability. So there really shouldn't be an insider or an outsider. If it's affecting the ability for the entire profession to practice, I think that's hugely problematic. that even that it is being seen as I'm an insider or an outsider. I mean, you as the executive director for the NASW-PA, that is very concerning. that you, for instance, would not be seen as somebody who would be receiving information or transparency with the organization who literally calls our fate. So the secondary comment to that is sort of what sort of accountability do they have when they create a test that is providing roadblocks and barriers for people to practice and essentially contributing to an already terrible workforce crisis. So I don't know if anybody has the answer to that, but that is my second question.
Since I don't know how to do hands up, I don't know where the little icon is that you press, but I think that it's a patriarchal process. And right there is a lot of the bias. It's a very patriarchal, hierarchical process. And that's what I'm taking away from what you're saying, Valerie and Joanna. In other words, social work doesn't operate that way. We emphasize collaboration, which is power sharing. There's a complete and total disconnect between students in the classroom and what they're learning, the way they're being tested. There's the way they're being tested in the classroom, and then the exam. Oh, and the exam prep, access to the exam prep materials and the exam itself. There's a disconnect. The dots, you can't connect the dots. Everybody wants their power, which is the patriarchal thing. There's no collaboration. So if anything, going forward, we have to emphasize collaboration. The NCLEX exam that the nurses take in the classroom, when they go to nursing school, they take exams that have NCLEX review questions built into them. So they don't get out of the nursing program on campus when they're not able to pass a certain percentage of the NCLEX exam. The NCLEX exam doesn't get into all the how to apply. It's core knowledge. It's plain old Bloom's taxonomy level 1 memorization. And to take out the bias, there, of course, there's going to be differences in how different groups and different cultures and how we apply things. So memorization, when I was teaching on campus, it was a dirty word. I was the faculty member that people complained about because I made my students memorize. And I'm doing field work with a student now, and I keep telling you, you got to memorize. Sorry, you know, but get rid of all the attempts. If going forward, if we could get ASWB to be more accountable, to work in a collaborative way, bring in a diverse group of people to define core knowledge, not the way CSWE does, which is so big, nobody could possibly measure up to it. Okay, but define some very basic core things that you don't get out of the university without knowing. And then collaboration. I'm appalled that you are thinking in terms of insider, outsider. And to me, it is all about money. It is, whenever there's obfuscation, ambiguity, it's a smokescreen. Somebody's hiding something behind that. Processes can be very simple and transparent. And when they're not, look at the money, follow the money trail. And that's usually where it is.
Right, Lance.
So hello, everybody. There are some really brilliant minds on this call, and I'm just enjoying the dialogue that we're having. Something that struck me that Margaret and Kiana had both said was almost, so one of the first reason I came on is because of the comment that I made in the chat. So, and Margaret kind of just spoke on it again, which is there a way to provide oversight collaboratively? Because we know everyone's not invited to the table, right? Everyone's not an NASW member. Everyone's not an ASBW, ABSW member. Everyone doesn't always join these professional organizations because in some rights and some identification, they reinforce the patriarchy. So I want to be clear that when we talk about, but my question was, can we provide oversight collaboratively amongst all of these organizations so everybody has a voice at the table? The reason that ABSW even came into existence is because there was no place for them in NASW. So I want to be clear that when we talk about inviting people to the table, inviting voices that are diverse, is there a way to collectively build a bridge? But the enemy of my enemy is a friend. Is that, I don't want to say that, you know, ABSW is an enemy, but in this sense, they are. So I want to be very specific and intentional, because I think there's an intentionality. And I also think that there's a lot of reworking that some of us on this call have to do, because we were raised and we were taught in this patriarchy. We were raised and we were taught to understand social work. And that's why when people ask me, I joke and say I'm the minority in the field because I'm a Black male. Social work, being born as a white middle-class woman career. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking about these things. So when we say things like strike down the test, I'm all for burning something down, but we're going to have to replace it with something. So if we want to dismantle the test, rework the test, re-systemize the test with the actual people that can make sure that it's living up to what it's supposed to do, that would be the proper way, or the way to do it. A lot has changed since this test has come into being. A lot of the social work is Blacker than ever at this point. So for a test that was originally designed with white women in mind, this test no longer fits the demographic in which this career looks like. So those are just my thoughts. I just want to, my overall thought process is, if we can collaborate with these other social work organizations, then possibly there could be some oversight so that we are the ones writing the questions. And my last point is something that I think Matt had mentioned earlier, is that I think he was saying with psychology, there's a subset specific to the specialization in which that person specializes. If I'm a medical social worker by training, and that's what I've done up until this point, why am I learning about, I don't want to say child welfare, that doesn't make sense. Why do I need to know about community-based organizations and program development? That's not my niche. So just my thoughts, and carry on, everyone.
Well, can I just disagree real quickly with one thing, Lance? I like what you said, but the one thing I disagree with is macro drives micro. So
never said that.
No, you didn't say that. I'm saying it. You didn't say that. I'm saying it. I believe very strongly that if you're working at the micro level, you have to know macro, and vice versa. If you're looking at the macro level, you can't do a good job without knowing micro. Everything else I agree with. So I would, one of the things I love about social work is it's a career ticket on a train that'll take you anywhere. And I'd hate to see us become so specialized that we couldn't change trains. Anyway, I'll shut up. I'm done. Shut up.
Thank you. I did want to address Lance because we were going to save this to the end. But since this is coming up, I do kind of want to share this, and I'm kind of glad, because I think this means that myself, Joanna, and Kristie are on the right path, since this has come up so much in the conversation. As far as collaboration, this is something that we are doing currently. So we are drafting, we draft emails, and so these emails are going out to both ABSW and I believe licensing board. We actually emailed the licensing board to try and get a pathway onto the licensing board meeting. Additionally, we have also, we'll be reaching out to the deans and program directors of universities One thing that we know is that this is an effort that is going to take many minds, and this is not something that NASW can do alone. Not just the organizations, but as Kiana and many people have mentioned, students, like these are our future. I think, and the wise words of my supervisor, Valerie, students are the workers of tomorrow, or something like that. I don't know, but something along those lines. With that also being said, is that we want this to be a very transparent process. This is not something that, you know, is going to be behind closed doors. This is not something that we plan on shutting out members and non-members, because I think that's also important too. Kiana mentioned is that, you know, there are people who are not members that this still affects, and that just because they're not paying dues does not mean that we should not include them at the table. And so this is the first of what I hope to be many town halls or many involvements with this process. Additionally, to address, I think James or someone had mentioned about a task force. We did not think of that, but that's a great idea. However, we do have a workforce committee that has just started last month. That committee is small but mighty. That committee has loud voices. These are people who have background in research, have backgrounds in various things, professors, macro social work. And so these are things that we are constantly thinking of to how to move forward and how to address this issue, but not just the licensure, but everything else that goes along with licensure and everything else that goes along with workforce in our profession. And so I just say that to say that we are doing this as a collaborative effort, and that we are looking to be transparent with both members and non-members and have those voices included at the table as well.
The only thing I'll add to that, Sierra had mentioned like that we were doing outreach to ABSW, which in this case is ABSW, not ASWB. Like I know that one's tricky. The Association of Black Social Workers, but also will be included in that will be the Pennsylvania Society for Clinical Social Workers that we've also worked collaboratively with, and that I know Annette, who is currently their chapter president, is here on the call with us. That is going to be one of the discussions that we'll have to see how like the groups that are common here in Pennsylvania can work together on this issue within our respective memberships and within you know, and work collaboratively, ensuring that all voices are being heard. Beyond that, yeah, like I noted the summary about like getting on the state board agenda. Yes, that is part of it, and we're also going to be having a meeting with the deans and directors of the 35 different schools of social work within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
And Joanna, I wanted to say one more thing as we're wrapping up. I know I'm not on the board, but I think it's a really important point that when we go and we're talking with these folks and we're trying to build bridges, language is really important. If we could just be very explicit about what we mean about the test being biased, it's racist, right? And so I want to make sure that when you all are talking to people, that you are using that kind of language, because that just saying it's biased is like, oh, you know, no, it's racist. It's inherently has white supremacist properties. And we want to make sure that we're calling that out and that we're naming that thing. We don't want to sugarcoat this. We don't want to, you know, try to soften it up. You know how we do. We try to butter people up. We don't want to do that with this, right? Because people's lives are being impacted by this. And so we want to make sure that we're calling a thing a thing. It is racist. And then the second point of this is, I really hope that this conversation doesn't just stop here. I hear you all saying, you know, there'll be a continuation, but we've said that before. And so if there is any way, please include the folks on this call or make sure that it's out there. Make sure that you're telling your students, if you're here listening now and you know that your students are going to go take the test, please tell them, let them know that these things are happening so that they can be a part of this conversation too. Because if we just keep saying, oh, we're going to create a workforce, we're going to create a committee, that's fine. How many times have we created a committee and things just went, oh, 5 years down the line, oh, we still have a committee about that. So I just want to make sure that we're really moving from this. Yes, I really appreciated this conversation. So thank y'all for facilitating.
All right, looks like we have about 8 minutes left. I know there was quite a bit of things. The town halls are open to non-members, am I correct? Yeah, town halls are open to non-members.
And are free to all participants, members and non-members alike.
Yeah. All right, is there any other lasting comments? All right, Joanna, you want to close this out?
I'm typing the one thing in the chat right now about CEs. Just again, which I don't mind saying again, yes, you will receive an email with an evaluation for this event. Upon completion of the evaluation, you'll be able to download a certificate. Kristie typed in the chat a couple of times about like if you wanted to reach out to any of us. I think she put all of our email addresses in there. That includes if you would be interested in becoming a member of the workforce committee, for example. You know, if you would be interested in any of the things that we've talked about, that you would be, you know, that we do take volunteers. We'll throw out there just sort of the random, you know, the other commercial, because I think it got mentioned, you know, could we have something about this at the conference? I don't think we have anything about it currently scheduled at the conference, but we can make sure that that happens. And, but just to ensure that you know that that we are having a chapter conference live and in person, that I think a lot of us are looking forward to in about 6 weeks, I believe. And make sure you're registering now, getting your hotel rooms, etc. And at least we will have a hybrid virtual option for those of you who don't want to come in person, but it will not include all of the workshops. So just be aware of that as well. That's all of my last, you know, housekeeping stuff. Sierra or Kristie, do you want to share like closing thoughts?
Sure, I'll go, and then Sierra, if you want to wrap up completely, that'd be great. So
Can
again,
I ask a question before you do that? I am so sorry. The committees and things that you're talking about, are students invited to be involved, or is that only for folks at the professional level?
They are allowed, students are fully able to be part of any committee. What I will say is that NASW membership is required to be a part of, to be officially a part of a committee, which is why I definitely respected that comment and took it to note about like if we're asking for input or doing some kind of task force, that we're going to need to set it up in a way where perhaps non-members are able to join, which means we're going to have to call it something other than a committee or a task force or something like that, because like under our bylaws, NASW membership is required for participation in either of those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to kind of be mindful of time, we have 4 minutes left, and just for my final thoughts, just really thank you all so much for being here, hearing your voices, hearing what's important, you know, just thoughts about things that we've been thinking and knowing for years, but really being able to see the data that we've been giving, how it's impacting all of you in our Commonwealth. It's so important that we take this information back and we move towards action steps. So again, thank you for your vulnerability, for sharing with us, you know, just your thoughts and your feelings about this very important topic. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep it short and sweet because we are at the end of this meeting. We've been sitting on here for 2 hours. So the first thing is I just want to say thank everyone for attendance. I think this has been one of the most helpful conversations because as I said before, we're kind of sitting talking about these things, but coming here, listening to, you know, what everyone has to say, and you guys have got me thinking. So again, I just appreciate all of you coming, speaking up, and again, be on the lookout. I do not anticipate this being the last meeting, the last time that we are looking for involvement. So I hope that we can continue to have this conversation and see more faces involved in this process. So thank you guys and enjoy the rest of your evening. Joanna, you can